Thanks everybody for coming to attend this session. My name is Thiffault. I'm Métis from the Georgian Bay Métis community. I'm a Dasome, so I've got some connections in Georgian Bay, of course, where my family is today, but we have some connections across the Upper Great Lakes and further west onto Red River. But I'm legal counsel for the Métis Nation of Ontario, as well as the Director of Rights, Claims and Litigation. But today I'm here to talk to you about Métis families and political action in the Upper Great Lakes. Particularly about some of those key moments in our community's history, situating some of that history, and also speaking today basically to tell those stories, because with truth and reconciliation comes that history that needs to be understood by people beyond just our own communities. So thank you for everybody who's joining the live stream, and we'll get going. So before we can really get into the nitty-gritty and the fun stuff, we really need to set the scene and set who we're talking about, and talk about the origin story of the Métis people. And I like to root that in oral traditions. So I've got a couple quotes on the screen here, which I will save you the torture of having to hear me read out. But I've got a couple quotes here that come from actually quotes on the prairies, but they also talk about the origin of Métis communities beyond just that location. So the first two quotes here come from a recounting of the history behind the Thirsty Dance at Buffalo Lodge Lake, which was a ceremony that occurred in the 1820s in what is now contemporarily North Dakota. This came in the 1820s, but it's built on that late 17th century where we start to see, as a result of the fur trade, distinct Métis communities and families emerge as a result of those initial marriages between First Nations women and predominantly French voyageurs, as well as some Scottish fur traders. Those communities over time formed because the children of those unions started marrying each other through a process known as endogamy, which means like marrying like. And through that process, we start to see distinct communities evolve. We see an identity that is separate and apart from both the maternal and paternal side of the families emerge, as well as a unique culture that weaves in different cultural traditions from both sides, as well as unique Métis traditions. There's a unique style of Métis jigging and fiddling and beadwork, as well as on the southern prairies, there is the Michif language. But these two quotes at the top here talk about how some Métis people from that Upper Great Lakes area ended up on the prairies. As part of the fur trade, the Anishinaabe and the Métis from the Upper Great Lakes were pushing further westward into the plains and had been welcomed at that time by the Cree and Assiniboine. And to formally, I think my slide deck just went off, there we go. To formalize that relationship between those nations, they had to be brought in through ceremony. So a thirsty dance was called, and the Anishinaabe and the Métis were brought in. So in that story, they were brought into the Iron Confederacy, a political alliance on the prairies of Indigenous nations. And part of that history is about needing to bring people into relation because they are new to the territory, specifically the Métis. And three groups are identified in that oral tradition. There is the first, which comes from that northern Hudson Bay coastal ports, the York Factory, Moose Factory route, down southward towards where is now the Forks of present-day Winnipeg, then known as Red River. There are another group that has been in that Red River neck of the woods, and then this larger group, the most economically savvy of that group, as they're told in the oral traditions, that came from the Upper Great Lakes. It's those people that had to be welcomed to that territory. So I'm trying to do a very broad strokes on who the Métis people are. It's those people we're talking about, specifically those in the Upper Great Lakes who did not necessarily all go to the west. And when we're talking about these unique communities, they didn't emerge everywhere. Métis people aren't simply just this mixed race group of people. That is a common misconception. We are a distinct people that come from a very distinct place. And that, in the national definition that the Métis Nation has decided on, that is called West Central North America. And that geography, as I conceptualize it, I draw from this quote from a Métis activist and elder from Montana, Joe Dasome, who in the 50s talks about where the Métis people come from and his conceptualization of where Métis people are from. And he's talking about that group that first concentrates in the Upper Great Lakes, and they scatter throughout the Northwest, including the northern United States, northern Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana. Those are the people we're talking about, and we get distinct settlements and we get regional diversity within that Métis people. For today's presentation, we're really going to be focusing on that Upper Great Lakes corridor and those families that existed within it. I also just want to talk very, very quickly about the wording I'm going to use. So a lot of these documents I'm going to rely on now that we've talked a little bit about the oral tradition use the word half-breed to describe Métis people, and that is the word that the colonial government, be it Britain and then Canada, often applied to the Métis people. You see that in the historic record, and Métis people, when they're advocating for themselves in English to the Crown, often use that terminology as well. It's one of those words that is appropriate for Métis people to use to this day. It is a reclamation act, but historically it was used in a very negative connotation towards our people. It's also just one of the many names that Métis people use. Métis is one word historically that was used, as was half-breed, but there's also several different names in Cree and Anishinaabe-Moan that specifically speak to our people. So I just want to make that clear about that terminology. I will use the word half-breed a lot. I would consider that very much an in term, not to be used kind of outside the context of Métis communities talking about themselves. So pivoting back to that Upper Great Lakes community where, again, there's movement westward. There's some very key families that do move westward, and there's commonalities in culture, but the regional community we're talking about is within the Upper Great Lakes. So what you're looking at the screen here is just looks like a messy, colorful plate of spaghetti. What that actually is a massive kinship network across the Upper Great Lakes region with two poles, the northern pole being in what is contemporarily Thunder Bay, historically Fort William, and the southern pole being Penetanguishene in the southern part of Georgian Bay. But each one of those dots and clumps represent individuals and families, and those lines connecting them are connecting them through different relationships, be it marriages, baptisms, godparenting, and parent-child relationships. And each one of those dots, that is a colored dot, represents a different one of the communities we'll be talking about today. And the black dots are those interconnections among them. And when you start to see the story, you'll see that the Upper Great Lakes story is one story that slowly turns into several. Think of it like a Marushka doll, one of those Russian stacking dolls. There's the settlements, then there's the region, and then there's the larger people, that nation. So for this, we're talking about the region, but we're going to look at those specific settlements and the people who make up those specific settlements. So these people have a common way of life. Within the Upper Great Lakes, it's very heavily reliant on fishing. Several of these photos are just of members of the community. Some of these are photos, some of these are painting depicting Métis or half-breed fishermen in the Upper Great Lakes region. Some of these are in Sault Ste. Marie, some of these are in Penetang. That one painting there is Miss Laronde up in Nipigon. We don't know which member of that family, but she's a Delaronde, which is a well-known Métis family kind of from Ontario westward. Again, this is a common way of life. That's some of those more northern communities also on the prairies. Areas like Isle La Crosse and St. Laurent very much also heavily relied on fishing as their economy, in addition to some of their communities being part of those larger buffalo brigades in the plains. We also see a common way of life through material culture. That is a distinctly Métis material culture. Métis people on the prairies have been known as the flower beadwork people, and we do see examples of flower beadwork within the Upper Great Lakes as well.
Can you explain what that is, flower beadwork?
Flower beadwork, so like that right there, so beadwork, yeah. So the flower beadwork there is, for those on the live stream, he was just asking what flower beadwork is. And it's this type of floral beadwork that you can identify as distinctly Métis. So some of these, this is a member of the Georgian Bay Métis community. This is a burgee with a beautiful beaded vest there, graciously provided to us by a community member. In the top right, top left corner, there's an octopus bag, which is a very quintessential Métis style of garment. There's actually 8 little pockets at the bottom there. It's double-sided, and inside each one you could store different things. So it could be bullets, it could be different medicines, it could just keep things compartmentalized. But that's an octopus bag from a member of the Laurendale Brissette family in Georgian Bay. I'll be talking a little bit more about them, but this is just some of the material culture we see in the Upper Great Lakes, just some examples. Again, in addition to that common way of life, there's also the way Métis people lived. Often you will see Métis communities arise and start to form settlements along the fur trade routes. Examples here, we're seeing different houses, different places, and specifically one style of Métis settlement is a river lot system. That map you see in the upper left there is how a lot of Métis communities in Sault Ste. Marie, for example, in Red River, St. Albert, Alberta, those communities all set themselves up along the river system in long strips of land, and at the end there was this communal shared property where that's where you're usually getting into the bush and where shared resources can be found. But this is a very common style of how Métis organize themselves. And at that time when they're governing themselves, there's this unique symmetry kind of across that West Central North America that they all come together and they live in that way. They also have this collective identity, and we see Métis people prepared to fight for that common way of life and for that collective identity. What we see in many ways too is that they will assert themselves as Canada is pushing westward. So this map we have on here, we've overlaid where you see Métis petitions on top of where treaties are signed, and where Métis people are often petitioning for recognition of who they are as a distinct collective in this area where Canada is trying to take control, assert its legal authority, and negotiate a treaty. Métis people are making their voices heard. There's a massive history of Métis people petitioning. Often they will say the Métis people of here, but they're not saying Métis, they're saying half-breed. So we're going to hear that a lot more when I talk about petitions, but they say the half-breeds of, the half-breeds residing in. They relate themselves to place as a collective, not as, as the mixed race Anishinaabe people, for example. They are very clear that they are a distinct group, and they're recognized as a distinct group themselves, often with the other Indigenous peoples around them. Within the Sioux, we'll get more into that when I talk more about Sault Ste. Marie, but there's a lot of shared advocacy, recognition, and support from those communities. And we also see that out on the prairies during the negotiations of the Numbers treaties, where Métis people are excluded. There's one exception within the Treaty 3 area, the half-breed adhesion to Treaty 3. It's the only example where a Métis community came together and was allowed to collectively adhere to a treaty. Otherwise, Canada ignored all of these petitions. In addition to that, sometimes you don't get an answer to your petition, so you're going to push back. Métis people are prepared, historically as we are today, to fight for our recognition and demand that we be recognized. In the Upper Great Lakes, we see examples of pushback coming from Penetangwisheen, Sault Ste. Marie, Northwestern Ontario as well. But these are sometimes smaller. The Mica Bay incident, there's a riveting story we'll get to about borrowing a cannon and Bowie knives. But these are smaller pushbacks that people took up arms to fight for their lands, for their homes, for the territories they are from. And things culminate in other places. Out west, when Canada bulldozes westward and reaches the prairies and reaches Red River, there's a critical mass of Métis people there. We're talking 8,000 Métis people in the Red River settlement in 1870. So of course they push back. And in 1885, we see the next step where Canada sends military. The only time Canada declared war on an Indigenous people is against Métis people. But it's as Canada's machine pushes westward, it culminates in those big resistances. It culminates in those armed military conflicts. But there are little symmetries that are coming through. And it's just Canada intentionally ignores and excludes throughout all of that, hence the pushback. So I'm going to pivot now and get into a little bit more on the specific communities that make up the Upper Great Lakes. Like I said, we're kind of think of this as the poles of Fort William in the north and Penetang to the south. The Georgian Bay Métis community is predominantly itself within Penetang. But there's a unique history that goes about why there is a Métis community in that part of Georgian Bay. And I'm going to start with a quote by community member and well-known author Cherie Demeline about this community. In her book Empire Wild, which focuses on a cultural character known as the Rougarou, I grew up with stories of that in my home community of this kind of Métis werewolf that is very much a warning of act right or Rougarou will get you. It's something you can become, predominantly men, if you are not acting in accordance with communal norms and being respectful and being a good member of that community. But she starts the book with actually the history of the community because she sets it very much back home. So when she's talking about it, she says, the people who live in Penetangwisheen were brought from another place, moved off Drummond Island when it was handed over to the United States in 1829. They were half-breeds, the children of French voyageurs and First Nations mother and Métis people who had journeyed from Manitoba. They landed on the white rolling sands of Georgian Bay and set up their new homes across from the established town that wouldn't welcome them. So this community story is very unique because it comes as a result of the colonial violence that is the drawing of the international border. So I'm going to flip to the next slide to show we're going to talk about some of the families, but also how that history of these families and their movement in the Upper Great Lakes talks about that violence and the result of that movement. So originally, when we talk about the Métis merge in the Upper Great Lakes, we're talking this section over here, up to where modern Sault Ste. Marie is, down to Mackinac Island. It's in the late 1700s where we start to see those children born and that identity coalesce. During the War of 1812, you see Métis men who are, they're at the end of their teenage years, they're becoming adults, who sign up to defend their homelands as the Anishinaabe did and fight alongside the British as allies to defend this territory that they are from, that is their homelands. As a result of that war, we all know the international border gets drawn, but it takes a long time to figure out where that actual border is. And in this Upper Great Lakes area, it's kind of a mess, because if you look over here, Drummond Island, which is right here, where a lot of Métis people ended up settling after the War of 1812 and putting down roots, that ends up on the American side of the border. I don't know if you can see where the arrow is, but it's on the American side, and as a result, the Métis people are given a choice. You can stay there, and you can live as American citizens who you just fought a war against to defend your homeland, or the British said you can go to Penetanguishene or to other parts of the Upper Great Lakes for land grants. A large chunk of the community, including the Solomon family, who had served in the War of 1812, they moved down to Penetanguishene and they established themselves there. They're promised land grants. They don't ultimately get those land grants. After about 2 years, they're expected to clear this territory. They're not farmers. They're expected to clear this land, and they don't meet the British standards of what a settlement should be. So in many ways, the Métis people are living over on the other side of the bay, across from where the military garrison is, and they're building their community and continuing to live their way of life. One of those other families are the Labatts, and I'm specifically in this visual here talking about Michel Labatt. But Michel's dad was a War of 1812 veteran. One of those people promised those land grants, ultimately did not receive that. But Michel's a very interesting character in this story, because Michel himself seems to have emerged at any point there was an opportunity to petition, to push back, and say who he was and defend his land. Michel was there. So Michel is born during the War of 1812 on the American side of Sault Ste. Marie. His mom is from the Cadotte family, a very large and well-known Métis family whose connections span from the Upper Great Lakes out onto the prairies. And Michel's dad, they moved down to Penetanguishene, and he's a teenager. He's about 15, 16 once they're establishing themselves in Penetang. And he helps build the first church in Penetang. They petition for one. No one answers the petition. We'll notice that as a common theme in Métis history when we get into those petitions. But Michel himself petitions, and then he becomes a mail runner, back and forth between the Sioux for most of his life. He's up in the Sioux in 1838, where he petitions again and helps them build the first church there, which is known as Sacred Heart. He also then comes back to Penetang, and he's involved in a petition that we'll get to. And then 10 years later, he's back in the Sioux, living on one of those river lots, and he's there petitioning with that community. He's kind of one of these larger-than-life characters, and there's some really good accounts of like his mail running days. He used to make the journey in 13 days, and there's a couple really good interviews of his mail route that were done later in his life, and he goes, I almost lost my foot this one time, and how he had to use medicines and things he found on the route to heal himself. He goes, there was times I wish I would have just died. He goes, but when I look back, it was pretty fun. Like there's character that comes through in each of the stories, because we're very lucky that with the Georgian Bay community, a lot of people's narratives were written down and they sat down for interviews later in life. And a member of the Solomon family, for example, he has a really good story where he says, my name is Louis Solomon, Lewis, but everybody calls me Louis. And you can just hear like the tone of nobody wants to respect my name. But that plays into a Métis tradition of nicknaming. A lot of Métis communities, a lot of families, I have them in my own family, of people had nicknames. It was just a tradition. Oh, that's an after the presentation. I have a couple of those, but my Mamer's mom, all of her siblings had nicknames. Like my Mamer's cousins still refer to her mom by her nickname. But so as I was saying, the community's establishing themselves there, and there's still that connection back and forth in the Sioux. And what emerges is the community hears that something's happening with their relatives up in the Sioux that is no longer happening in Penetang. The Crown has started to ignore the Métis people as a distinct group around Penetang, because they've been down there for so long. The Crown starts excluding them from annual present giving. Presents were the Crown's way of maintaining diplomatic relations with Indigenous peoples before treaties. It was a precursor to treaty in the Upper Great Lakes of yearly exchanging of presents would renew those relationships, which the Crown needed to maintain any type of authority and power base in the Upper Great Lakes, because at that time they had no control. So people in Penetang get word that their relatives up in the Sioux are still getting presents, but that's not happening down in Penetang. So a group of them come together, and they surround Indian Agent Jarvis's house. For those of you familiar with Toronto, like Jarvis Street in Toronto is named after Samuel Jarvis. It's that guy. He was the Indian agent. He had a residence in Penetanguishene. So one night, a group of the community got together, and they decided they were going to press their claim. They surround his house with torches, and they demand he acknowledge it. He goes back to Toronto, and then nothing happens. So a couple months later, in January of 1840, they signed a petition of "We the half-breeds residing in the town of Penetanguishene." They note that their relatives in the Sioux are still getting this recognition, they're still receiving presents, and that they should be receiving those presents because they had served with the Anishinaabe and the British soldiers in the War of 1812. They had supported that effort, and there needs to be an ongoing relationship. The Crown's response to that, 2 years later, they create what is called the Mode of Excluding Half-Breeds from Presents, which says that there will be no presents to be received to any half-breeds, and particularly those who are those small bands who were formerly at Drummond Island and who are now at Penetanguishene. So the Crown creates a policy that really applies to Métis people thereafter. It pushes westward that whenever the Crown is about to effect control and sign treaties, they just ignore Métis rights. They ignore Métis, even when Métis are standing up and demanding to be acknowledged. I mean, it changes over time, how they frame it, how they decide to exclude Métis people, but this policy and its mentality very much become embedded in Canada's treatment of Métis people pretty much thereafter. So petition is unanswered. Instead, they get a formal response. And what is happening too is Samuel Jarvis is consistently talking about every time we go around to give presents, not only are the half-breeds coming forward to demand they be included, First Nations are acknowledging that you need to be acknowledging these people, you need to be including them in this presence. The Crown, they don't bother, they ignore it. This is just a map showing some of those families that did petitions, and so the inner circle shows some of those families: Longlads, Michel Labatt, our usual suspect, the Serres, other Labatts, Payets, but it also shows the larger connection within the community of how these people are also advocating for that larger community's rights, as well as connections to Sault Ste. Marie through several of the families like the Cadots and the Serres. But despite there being no answer to that petition, they don't go anywhere. A couple years later, Penetanguishene is known as the nearest point of Western Canada where you first see the half-breed. That's because the population maintained itself there and continued to live across the bay. You see tons of records that continually acknowledge the fact that there is a Métis community within that area, be it during scarlet fever outbreaks, where the doctors are very curious to see how the Métis people will fare compared to the First Nations. But you also see other Métis families slowly put themselves within the community, being welcomed in and becoming key members of the community. So in this one photo right here, that's Antoine Labatt, that's the younger brother of Michel Labatt. But in this other photo, we have Louis Solomon, we can't get his name wrong. We have John Brissette, we have a member of the Laramie family, and we have Francois de Somme. Francois is a great something uncle of mine, but Francois' family and John's family both come from out west. They're an example of those families that get brought into the community over time. So this is a movement map that shows the Brissette family's movement throughout the Northwest, focusing predominantly on Hippolyte Brissette, who was the French father of the Brissette family. But he ends up marrying a Métis woman by the name of Archin Larondelle in Lesser Slave Lake. And that family's movement throughout that entire West Central North America, before settling down in Penetang in the 1840s, is very much that mobility that continued to happen less and less over time as people started to form more rooted settlements. But this is those connections we see with the Brissette family, who, again, as I noted earlier, that's that octopus bag. It's members of that family who were actually born out west who bring that bag, and that is still within our community. I also mentioned the de Somme family. This is my family. We come from Francis Claremont was a Métis woman born in Red River in the 1800s, and they slowly moved west. After breaking free from the Hudson Bay Company, Francois and them slowly moved towards Sault Ste. Marie. They're living in the Sioux in 1830 alongside other Métis families like the Cadots and the Nolans, and eventually they relocate to Penetanguishene. And the de Sommes become a very interesting family because they become really big fishermen. There's a lot of de Sommes. Like anybody who's been to Penetang, you've met a de Somme, whether you know it or not. There's more than one in this room, excluding myself. But what ends up happening is one of the de Sommes by the name of William de Somme, his dad was that guy in the photo earlier, Francois Jr. He ends up pushing back. He's a fisherman. He's well known for fishing just outside of Penetang on this little rock called Gin Rock. And as the Ministry of Fisheries is slowly putting in fishing regulations, clamping down on commercial fishing and other areas, and regulating the way of life that has fed these communities for generations at this point, William de Somme is noted to be a real pain to the ministry officials who are recording that there's this half-breed Thiffault who's constantly net fishing, and we just can't catch him. It's like they try to catch him around Gin Rock, and he seems to be avoiding them. And then they go, and then the next year we show up, and he's built a shack, and he's brought others, and they're just kind of thumbing their nose and going, you're not going to impact our way of life. And that's in the late 1800s. But cut to 30 years later, almost 100 years after that Drummond Island migration story, we see that Penetang is still very much known as this community. The community is still present across the bay. There's an article in the Toronto Star from 1921, actually the same year the last number treaty is signed, the last year that the Métis script commissions on the prairies are occurring. There's this article that talks about Penetangwisheen and the community that's still living across there. You can see this place called Pinery Point. That's what we also call as across the bay. But there's little houses there, and then there's members of the community. But they describe the community as along its shores dwells a group of people, half French, half Indian, isolated in location, distinct in its habits and privileges, and fiercely resentful of intrusion on either. It is the origin of these picturesque Métis or half-breeds. This community is still there, it's still present. The guy in the middle there is the name, they don't get his full name, they call him McCoy de Somme. His name's Isidore, but that's another example of those nicknames. McCoy's older brother is William. They call him a jolly youth of 75. So you get a little bit of that character that comes through in this. But this is just an example that over 100 years later, the community is still very much there, living its way of life after having defended its right, petition for who they were. I'm going to switch very quickly over to talk about Killarney, which Killarney itself is really just a really small town. Historically, I think there was 80 people there. There's probably 100 now, but it's a really small town that was originally established as a trading post by the Lamorandier family, who had left Drummond Island. Some of those members of those family end up in Penetang for a bit. They move back and forth, but Killarney becomes that middle point between Sault Ste. Marie and Penetang along that mail route. And Lamarandier's trading post ends up being kind of a hotel where people will stay overnight. And there's a ton of this quote on here, for example, talks about how they danced away the night away with the gay and lively half-breeds, giving you a little bit of character about what is happening in that neck of the woods at that time. This is just another little photo, like I said. If anyone who's ever been to Killarney, it's not much more built up. I think that might be the fish and chip place now. Best fish and chips ever. But anyway, so, but other families are, key families that end up in that neck of the woods are Solomons and Labatts, like I mentioned earlier. They maintain that intergenerational movement in that, oh, and we lost it again. But they maintain that intergenerational connection between that place over generations. Some members are in Killarney, some are in the Sault, some are in Penetang, but they're constantly moving back and forth. And we see that also as early as 1838, the Métis people at Killarney, after not being, being ignored when it comes to those treaties on Manitoulin Island, they're trying to make sure they can protect their fishing rights in that neck of the woods so they can continue to live their way of life. But the Lamorandier family and fishing rights kind of re-emerge in the late 1890s when you see, we're talking about William de Somme fighting against the fishing regulations. We see probably the only example of Métis and Anishinaabe people trying to enforce fishing regulations occurring around 1894 in Killarney, because as the fishing regulations are coming in, at that same time, a massive number of settlers are moving north. They're moving into what is now Killarney, and they are decimating the fish population. There's about 10 of them that are noted as just reaping and leaving fish on the shores and depleting the fish populations to the point where Pierre Regis Lamorandier, the grandson of the man who founded Killarney, he ends up becoming a lighthouse keeper, as is his cousin just a little further down. And the Anishinaabe come to him and they're acknowledging, like, there is a problem, we need to stop this. So Lamorandier starts clamping down on them. He starts enforcing the law on them, and they strike back at him. The settlers go on a smear campaign. They kill his livestock. They harass his family. There's a quote on here too of there's a very specific violence they inflict upon the family. They break into his house one night and they steal his wife and his daughter's undergarments, and they wear them and they parade around as a way to humiliate him. So there's been some work done looking at what that is. It's called chivalry. So it's actually a humiliation tactic that comes from Europe, and it was inflicted on the Lamorandier family a couple different times, where it was in there to just humiliate him. That didn't stop him though. He was going to say, you are not going to continue to disrespect the fish in this way. So what does he do? He continues to do it. What do the settlers do? They try to have him killed. They get the whole town riled up, And it's members of the Labatt family, the Solomon family, as well as a few others that come together and warn him, and they protect Lamorandier from this. He survives. There are descendants of the family to this day. I know a few of them, but there is this act of trying to protect the waters that they were subjected to quite a violent incident over and over again. When we're looking to that northern pole I was talking about earlier in northern Lake Superior, this is that there's a lot of families here that are moving between both poles, and it's also a nexus point further west. You see families like the Delerons going through here, Collinses, Chatelains, etc. This community also was a little bit smaller in the sense of they were very much internal. As the fur trade dwindled and Fort William lost its importance, these communities continued to have little fishing posts around, say, modern-day Red Rock, which is historic Nipigon. There's that photo of Miss Laurent cleaning fish over in Nipigon. Again, a little bit further south within that community is also Michipicoten area, where their parties, we've talked about this a little bit earlier, of like Métis people have a good sense of humor, but there's also these well-known parties where we're seeing fiddlers and jiggers being recorded in newspapers as far as Boston, coming out of this neck of the woods. And even when the treaty commissioners are coming through ahead of the Robinson-Huron Treaty, they're talking about the parties that are happening at Michipicoten and the lively half-breeds that are entertaining them. But this community's political pushback, is it me? This community's political pushback continues. They, some of them continue to live. They're excluded from the treaties. But what we do ultimately see is in the 60s, at the same time as Métis governments, what are now Métis governments out west, are reforming. The Métis Nation of Alberta, for example, the Métis Nation Saskatchewan is founded in 1964. But the following year, in 1965, the Lake Nipigon Métis Association is founded by a man named Paddy McGuire from around the Nipigon area, and they're part of that larger revival of Métis political advocacy that had gone silent a little bit at the end of the 1920s. We see this revival of historic governance, and Paddy McGuire is a very fiery person. For those of you who know Tony's a contemporary of Paddy, but in the 1960s, there was some national leaders meetings. This one was in Calgary, but the Métis leaders are ready to fight white racist discrimination. This is where Métis, from BC to the Lake Nipigon Métis Association, they all came together in Calgary. They're talking about what they're facing, what they're trying to help their communities with. You have activists like Jim Sinclair, who's quoted in this article. You have talk about the Manitoba Métis Federation case that dealt with the Section 31 promises to Métis people of the Red River Settlement as part of the Manitoba Act. The seeds of that case are woven in here. And then they get to the Lake Nipigon people, who are described for their radical tactics. Again, fishing regulations, they're really clamping down on them, and Paddy McGuire and them said, no, we're gonna fish the way we've always fished. And they said, no, like hell you are. And Paddy and them said, well, if we can't fish, no white person's gonna fish, we'll put lampreys in the water. And so they left them alone. Lampreys were never put in the water, but they were willing to fight and push back in whatever way they could. So yeah, that's what we're seeing in that neck of the woods. And now we're going to talk about the Sioux, and I think I only have about 15 more minutes. And the Sioux is really that nexus point of pushback in the upper Great Lakes. So there's a lot to get through here. So if I start barreling through, bear with me. What we see in the Sioux is that community. It's similar to the fact that with Drummond Island, a lot of families went to Penetang. A good chunk had already been at the Sioux, and a few more had joined them. And some of those land grants had been given at the Sioux. That ultimately becomes that Riverlock community I was showing you the map of earlier. And they were known to just be living there like their Métis relatives across the prairies on that river lot system. And there's a quote here on the screen of, they made their own laws, rules, and regulations, which each one observed, as there was no white people in the Sioux. They were governing themselves as their own people, and they had relationships with their neighboring Anishinaabe relatives. They were big fishermen too. Several attempts to clamp down on fishing happened there. The Sioux Métis pushed back several times. They were constantly recorded as jumping across that international border, because the St. Mary's River just divides Sioux, Michigan from Sioux, Ontario. They didn't care. They were fishing back and forth. They were also lumbering back and forth, all things the HBC and eventually the Crown were trying to clamp down on. They even tried to get Chief Shingwak, who was the head chief of the Anishinaabe at that time, to be the person to deliver that message, and they said no, thank you. So they continued to do that pushback. Here's a painting of the river lots, and the river lots became that core of the community in the Sioux in the historic period, living along there. But again, not long after the Drummond Island relocation, in 1835, the Indian Department tries to get them to move off the river lots. And again, just like when they asked them to, clamp down on fishing and stop lumbering, they just said no. They offered them a Peaslee amount of money, and they said, "This is where we're from. We're not going anywhere." So that was the first early attempt to relocate that community, because the Sioux became a very critical point from an economic perspective and also a political perspective, just because of the international border. But again, around that exact same time, there's concerns that the Métis people are bristling here. They're not exactly dealing well with the HBC. They're living their own way of life. There's no control over them, is how the Crown keeps seeing it. And there's no actual influence on the local Anishinaabe on them, because they are living a distinct community. Then there's rumors in 1838 here of Louis Nolan and Louis Garneau turning a ball, one of those famous parties, into a political moment where they're going to rally and there would be a rebellion within the Sioux. Interesting, there's connections with Louis, both of these Louis. Louis Garneau's son ends up being in the provisional government of Louis Riel in 1870 in Red River. And Louis Nolan is related to all those Nolans. Here's all the Nolans, all the other Nolans. But Louis Nolan himself actually was a witness to the Battle of Seven Oaks, a massive victory for the Métis people in Red River in 1816. That really was an attempt to break some of the economic tensions between the Métis and their allied Northwest Company and the HBC. But that's a story for another day. But this is just an example of the Nolan family is one of those families that had ongoing connections back and forth across that time and find themselves involved in resistances in the Sioux, as well as Red River, and ultimately at Batoche through Charles Nolan, who was a member of both Riel's provisional governments. But ultimately, when we're talking about this community, we're also needing to talk about their relations with the Anishinaabe. We have talked about how the Crown and the HBC tried to have the Anishinaabe convince the Métis and the Sioux to do things that they wanted to do, and they said no. But as the Crown was coming in and there was more and more mineral developments and mines being built in the Upper Great Lakes, the Anishinaabe became increasingly worried, and they were trying to build an alliance among the Upper Great Lakes people to push back and to protect their homelands and protect their rights. And ahead of that, they call in council. The Métis people had come together, they held a council, and the chief brought them all together and offered them, if you join my band, I'll protect you, and we'll fight back on this. And ultimately, all of them said no, except the couple who had already married Shingwak's daughters. They said no, that we are Indian enough without binding ourselves under an Indian chief. They didn't need to be part of that larger Anishinaabe political world because they had their own. That's a quote from a member of the community, Joshua Biron. That's a photo of him right there, another mail carrier, contemporary of Louis Labatt. Very grainy photo, but I'm a big dog person, so I just like to include that photo. But ultimately, the next year, things culminate a little bit more, and the Métis end up allying with Anishinaabe under the two leaders. They have Eustache Lesage and Charles Boyer, and the two of them with Shingwak and another chief, Nebbedagoching, they rally a bunch of Métis people and Anishinaabe, and they march on a mine at Mica Bay. They, I have to say this for my friend Mitch, who's not here, but they borrowed a cannon. They did not steal a cannon from the Hudson Bay Company. They put it on a ship, they bring it up there, they arm themselves with Bowie knives, and they knock at the door, and the person running the mine is informed that the mine is under occupation and all operations are shut down. A couple other events transpire at that time, and ultimately Shingwak, Nebbedagoching, and the two Métis leaders, they give themselves up for arrest. They are arrested on behalf of everyone else. Everyone else goes back home, and ultimately they're not charged. The charges are dropped, but this is what triggers the negotiations for the Robinson-Huron treaties, the Robinson treaties. So what's happening there is a political action, Métis people allying with Anishinaabe, and it triggers that negotiation. But it's not just necessarily an incident within Mica Bay or within the Sioux. This is a larger geopolitical consciousness within the Métis world, because that same year, in the fallout of the Mica Bay incident, the Hudson Bay official in the Sioux is writing to Red River, warning that the rumors in the Sioux are that 2,000 Red River half-breeds are coming to join them and act as allies in the spring. So the active concern is that, our cousins over there are going to come and support us. That same year is the Sayers trial in Red River, which became a rallying point for Red River Métis free trade rights. Guillaume Sayer right there on the where is that? That's my right. He's on the right there. He's from Sault Ste. Marie. His nephew is living on one of those river lots. We'll talk a little bit more about the river lots and those petitions in a moment. And on the left there is Louis Riel Sr., the father of Louis Riel, who rallied the Métis community in Red River to surround the courthouse when Sayer is being trialed for trading illegally, as the HBC called it. Ultimately, he's convicted, and as they walk out of the courthouse, there's no sentence given because Riel and the other Métis people had surrounded that, and there was concern that if they actually had to put a penalty on him, there would have been an armed resistance. So there's this larger geopolitical thing happening with the families, and again, this is the Sayer family. I show these maps very quickly because I am short on time, but there's this ongoing movement of members of that family who are involved in political action. Guillaume's brother, for example, John Charles Sayers, was one of the Métis people from the Sioux who was involved in rallying troops in the Upper Great Lakes ahead of getting to the Battle of Seven Oaks that I mentioned earlier in the plains. They ultimately were arrested and didn't get there. But that family has been quite politically active, and like I said, one of the nephews is Toussaint Sayer, who's listed on one of the river lots here. He ends up being one of those people that petitions along with the Sioux, because as the negotiations are happening with the Anishinaabe, Chief Shingwak and Nebenegojing are insistent that the Métis people need to be included in the treaty, but not as necessarily as part of their bands, but just securing these river lots, securing their 100 acres of river lots, and making sure that they are not going to lose their homelands, that they have a right to. That is actually acknowledged by one of the HBC officials a little bit further north as actually maybe being better than some of the chiefs, because they were actually born upon that soil, whereas some of those Anishinaabe bands had come from other parts of Michigan up to what is now Garden River. Ultimately, Treaty Commissioner Robinson says, "I'm not here to deal with half-breeds, don't have a mandate for that." That's a direct quote. But he says, "But I will promise you free and full possession of your lands," and suggests that they write a petition to affirm that. They ultimately do write this petition, and so do the chiefs the same day, a month after the treaty is signed, trying to secure these lands. The Métis community sends one the same day as the chiefs, who are saying you need to acknowledge their claim and their river lots. So they don't, though. It's that mode of excluding half-breeds, that continual policy of Canadian law of excluding Métis people, and within 10 years, the entire river lots, which this is downtown Sault Ste. Marie if you've ever been there, was entirely dispossessed from the community, and the community was displaced all over the place. This is just some of the families. Again, I don't have a lot of time left. So these are some of the families that make up those petitions, and this is their connections into the larger geopolitical realm in the Upper Great Lakes and westward. And here's a map comparing the two petitions from Penetang and the Sioux. And of course, the rebel rouser Michel Labatt's in the middle of that Venn diagram, because he's also living on that river lot in the Sioux. He's buried in Penetang, but he's living on that river lot. He petitions. He's part of that political action. These are some of the other families as well: the Miron family, the Busno family, the Cadot family. These are all different people who are part of that family who ultimately are dispossessed from those river lots. Like I said, the Busno family is another example. They trace through Marguerite Guimont, who is from what is now kind of what we call it Northwestern Ontario. I'm not entirely sure where it would have been at that time, but along the English River area. She's a Métis one from there. They end up settling in the Sioux. Massive family. 6 of them signed the petition. There's also the Roussain family. They're involved in a lot of Métis political action. Again, part of that group of Métis people trying to make it to Red River ahead of the Battle of Seven Oaks. But they also found Roussainville, which is a little town, which was a little town now, just to the north of what is Mica Bay, where the cannon was stuck in the mine, for example. And they form a little community there. Several of these dispossessed families, the Busnos, the Roussains, the Mirons, the Davios, they all come together and have this beautiful little town at Agua Bay that is established by like the beginning of the 1900s. So around that first decade, and there's a couple generations of them that are there. There's a party there. Again, we always go back to these parties. There's Arthur Davio with his fiddle. But this is just the community itself. These are members of the Busno family. That's Dolores and Bud. There's Bud, and there's them all grown up. Dolores was a wealth of knowledge in the Sault Ste. Marie community. She was a really respected elder. She passed away actually earlier this year in July, but her older brother Bud is 92 and he's still harvesting in the community. But that bench there is basically all that's left of Agua Bay, because in 1968, the Ministry of Forests came in and just burnt the village to the ground, basically unannounced. That's the Busno house ablaze. That's their grandmother's house. that's burning. They came in there and just burnt it down to make way for Lake Superior Provincial Park. No warning, no eviction notice. They just came in and they just burnt it to the ground. There's some very telling interviews with some of the people who were involved in burning the village, but the village itself was burnt to the ground. And that's an outstanding thing where Dolores and them carried that history. They carried that story of just, it didn't matter because we were Métis and it didn't matter. They needed the park. So that's some of the story of what some of the impacts are of the displacement from those river lots. That Canada ignoring that petition, Canada ignoring its own treaty commissioner's promise to protect lands, that's part of that narrative of what are the impacts of dispossession and broken promises. Even in living, like there's people in this room who would have been alive when that happened. That was the same year my parents were born. Like this is not ancient memory. Those people, they carry that. So that little bench there is in memory of their mother. That's all that's there. It's this beautiful little bench, painted yellow because it was their mom's favorite color, just overlooking the bay. But otherwise, it's just a provincial park, and you wouldn't know that this was once a place where Métis people had to seek refuge after they'd already been dispossessed. And so I'm getting we're running out of time. We have to go on to the next show. But in addition to that, we also have the modern legacy of this community's desire to stand up for who we are. And this is about the Powley case. And I recommend all of you go and watch the Powley documentary called The Hunt for Justice, made by Métis filmmaker Matt LeMay, who's sitting here in the front row. This case was about the Powleys, Steve and Roddy Powley. That's Steve right there. Steve and Roddy were members of the Métis community in Sault Ste. Marie. Their ancestor is Eustache Lesage, who was one of the leaders who was arrested at the Mica Bay incident. They said enough's enough. I'm not going to hide who I am anymore. They harvested a moose. They tagged it with their Métis card, and they were charged. A decade later, the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed that they hold Section 35 rights to harvest, that Métis people exist as a distinct people. And that's the sacrifice that family and that community was willing to make. And that could be that's a whole documentary worth of information. But I wanted to end with the political advocacy of that place, of the Sault Ste. Marie Métis community as part of that larger regional connection. That's what the legacy is. I also recommend everybody check out Amanda Rayom, who's also in the audience. She released a new song called I Won't Hide, based on this. Based on the Powley case and in memory of Steve. So I do recommend you guys check out those resources because it's a different way of telling that story and a strong story. And so I'll end it there. I don't think we have time for questions, but.